Good morning, everyone. Good morning. It's good to see you all here, and like I say, I had some fun this week. I mentioned just a bit of looking up some writings from Elder L.L. Christensen, and here's one of them. And he always did a nice job. He'd send them into the newspapers or send them into the Bible Advocate, and he'd hand them out all over the place and make them available for us. And when I was in Oregon, he'd mail them to me. And this isn't even scrunched in folding or mailing or anything. This is really great to hang on to. And he did his own copy and paste, paste up to make a front to it. And of course he made the wooden things around the building here that are the scripture verses on them. And this happened to be defending the Ten Commandments. And I thought, wow, that's what my sermon is about. But I won't use this directly. I have different material that I'm using, but that's interesting that I found that this week as well. And then while I was looking, I knew that I had other materials around. And here's some. I wonder how old is this topic that I'm preaching about? These are old. It's always been, I guess, is a good way to put it too. I've got January 1975. There's three of these that I had. One I've loaned to somebody and it hasn't come back home. But I have 2 of 3 and 3 of 3 copies of the Two Covenants. The Two Covenants. It went by various names like the Two Laws. Back in the 50s, the Two Laws. And I've got a 75 and a 76, 1976, 1975. These booklets on the commandments, statutes, and ordinances. So I'm not teaching a brand new topic, just not using these directly. But same idea, the topics have been around for a long time. And the kind of controversy of which laws are which, where do they apply? Some were before the flood, some were before Moses. You know, what are those laws back there? And then you know that you'd have the laws that Moses wrote, and God gave him the information to write about. And then you have another set of laws that God wrote with his finger. And you think, oh, now let's see. The New Testament, some people want to say all the laws are done away with, but they're missing it. There's actually 3 sets of types of laws that we could think of. What kind of laws fit before Moses' time? We often say, this is Moses' laws, and we don't have to do Moses' laws. That's not exactly true. Okay. Moses wrote the first 5 books, so of course he told what happened before the flood and what happened before his time. God gave him that information so that he could write it down of what was meaningful and needed there. And last week's sermons, the law of God, brought in a little bit of that too, of all the things that God has said is his laws. Well, if you go through the laws of the scriptures and you say, we need to have we need to look at the laws and see what can be done with them, is a good attitude. So we're going to look at the laws and see what we can do with them. Well, if you run across a law about marriage, say, hey, we ought to keep that one, you know. We know that marriage was from Genesis 1:1 sort of thing, right? So they're important to be looking at what God had to say about marriages. And some of the laws we say we're glad that we don't have them. That's important. Especially ones where you have to kill an animal and sacrifice it. And the blood, the sprinkling, the type of church they had, and the sprinkling of blood here and there, and the odor of the offerings burning and so on. We're very glad that that is not part of the New Testament. Jesus was the Lamb that was slain from the foundation of the world. So it makes it a little different when we start looking at the laws and saying, what can I do with them, rather than just saying, I don't need to hear that. I don't need to know that. There's good principles and standards and so on. I pointed out last week that various things. So last week's lesson was the law of God. And we're continuing this week with a similar idea, but it's called the law of God and the law of Moses. Or law laws of Moses, even could be said. So I want to let you know where we're going a bit with the law of God and the laws of Moses. Does the Bible make any distinction between the laws of Moses, ceremonial laws, and the law of God, which would be the Ten Commandments God wrote with his finger? And this lesson is intended to clear up the misunderstanding regarding these two laws. There's an awful lot of talk about two laws back in the 50s and early 60s when I first really woke up to that there was a challenge going on, or that I needed to learn more about it. And so I really came into that era knowing about these and a lot of struggles that were going on in people's minds and how they were discussed in various churches around the country. And so it's good to know these. They used to have a booklet. I couldn't find it. I guess that's why I was scrambling through a lot of material. But there was a booklet on the two laws, was the title of the booklet. I'm sure I got one, but I just couldn't lay my hands on it. They're out of print. I don't suppose that's the best idea to lose that material, so if I find it, it's going to be held on to. I'm sure I have it. I'm not going to let that escape. So you'll hear me talking somewhat about the different kinds of laws and different things that pertain to it. So today, when God gave the Ten Commandments, he wrote them on stone. So you need to really catch that really quickly, that which are God's laws. Actually, they're all God's laws, right? Nobody else can give us laws, right? Okay. God told Moses what to write, so they're God's laws. But when we say that God's laws, or the law, we're often referring to the one God wrote with his finger, God's law, written with his finger. And then we can separate that from other laws. So in Deuteronomy chapter 5, in verse 22, a few of these verses may be similar as we go through the topic today or last week's topic. You may hear somewhat of the same scripture or words used, and you might want to take a pencil and paper and jot some down. But this is Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 22. Verse 22. These words the Lord spake unto all your assembly in the mount out of the midst of the fire, of the cloud, and of the thick darkness, with a great voice. And he added no more. And he wrote them in 2 tables of stones, and delivered them unto me. So that's Moses speaking there. Got to think back through this verse. There's a lot in a little verse like this. The words which the L-O-R-D, all capitals, spake unto your assembly. They heard him. Isn't that amazing? God spake these laws to him, besides writing them on the tables of stone. And they heard him. That's amazing. You know, it happens so rarely that somebody would hear God's voice. And these are words that he spake, and everybody heard it, to the whole assembly. They heard it. And he spoke from a cloud and so on the mountain and so on. So he was giving this admonition. And then when he was done with those commandments, it says in the middle of the verse, and he added no more. Well, we know there's 600 and some laws, right? And they're God-given through Moses. Why does it say he added no more? Because this law is very, very important. These 10 commandments were so important, he wrote them with his own finger, spoke them with his mouth, but in stone, engraved them in stone. These are very, very important to know what these mean. And they're actually good for us. They're not something that gets us in trouble and gets problems for us or whatever. They're a good deal that God wanted us to know about. And then he wrote them on 2 tables of stone, so we know which laws we're talking about. And he delivered them to Moses. Okay, so there's one set of laws. that we could say, the law of God. And the quality of the law, that it was written with the finger of God, and that he spoke no more. He had spoke these words specially to the people. So here's one. Where did Moses write the laws and statutes besides the Ten Commandments? I had to think on this for a while. This is in a question form, but where? Oh, that's interesting. That's different. So I started thinking through this, and I said, okay, he went up the mountain with the tables of, first he got the tables of stone and he broke them. Then he had to carve the stones himself and go back up, and God wrote them again. If Moses was going to break the stones, he's going to have to carve them out himself. Okay? You learn your lesson. You don't want to carve these tables of stone. So he went up, but then it starts talking about Moses' laws. Well, when did he write these? He had plenty of time, right? If you look at when the law was given in the tables of stone, at the beginning of their journey, they went over to the promised land. They didn't go in, so there's 40 more years. When did Moses write all these things? Well, the first 5 books of the Bible were written by Moses, so sometime in that journey. So let's go to Deuteronomy 31. That makes sense. At the end of Deuteronomy is the end of the first 5 books of the Bible. Deuteronomy 31, beginning with verse 24. Just go to 26, so there's only 3 verses here. And it came to pass, when Moses had made an end of writing of the words of this law in a book, until they were finished. His writings, including the laws, what were they going to do with these 5 books? And Moses commanded the Levites, which bear the ark of the covenant of the Lord, saying, take this book of the law, and put it in the side of the ark of the covenant of the Lord, your God, that it may be there for a witness against you. Did I get that all correct? Deuteronomy 31, 24 through 26. Okay, so here he's got a time frame, because he's coming to the end of his life. If you go back and read in this chapter, you find that it's time. He's come to the end of his time. He wrote a song as well, and then he's here writing, and the end of his life is coming, and he's got to put the charge over on Joshua, and he did, and so on. And now he's doing one more thing. He's finished this writing. That's what it said there, right? In verse 24, the end of verse 24, he finished it. Then he gave it to the Levites, which would be the best way of protecting it. And he told them, take this book of the law. Now, was it only one book of these 5? Probably all 5. Okay, the book of the laws. There's some laws in each of the books. First 5 books. But he gave them to him, and he said, put it in the side of the Ark of the Covenant of God. Well, that sounds well and good, but you got to think one more notch. Where was the Ark kept? In the Most Holy. So it had to be copied again, and the original put in the Most Holy. So if they could read this amongst the people, they could transcribe it again. They were extremely careful in transcribing and recopying it. Extremely careful. So, but they did have the master copy over there. Now some people talk about the lawyer effect, the one copy that the people can use, and the other copy is kept with the lawyer, and God's the lawyer, So that's a comforting thing, that the master was still there. The master copy was still there. Both sides had agreed. Both sides had a copy. Okay? So it was put in the side of the ark. Now, the ark is never described as having a pocket, or they're scrolls of leather, right? Did they lean it against the ark? Did they make something that hung on one of the handles or the bars so that they could put this roll in there? Was there more than one roll? Maybe 5 rolls? I mean, that's quite a bit of writing. When you do it by hand on leather, it's quite a bit of writing. We don't need to know that, right? The thing we need to know, it was at the side of the ark. It wasn't inside of the ark, but it was on the side of the ark. And that it was in the most holy part of the temple, so that it was well protected and not going to get spoiled or ruined or deteriorate in that location. And it would be a witness against them. That sounds bad, but actually it's good. You agreed to this and you've got a copy of it. There's not going to be any funny business going on because you agreed, you signed, you accepted, and so on. And it's a witness for them that both sides know what the agreement was. It can be against you if you go against the law. Okay? You can say, well, you knew better, that way. But as long as they would obey God's will, that was what was most important. Now there's another thought on this, is where were the laws of Moses kept? Well, for sure it was at the side of the ark. And then also a copy that the Levites had, because they had to have scribes that would transcribe it, and they had Levites that had to teach it, and so on. Same text, same idea. What distinction was made with respect to the Ten Commandments? In Exodus 24, verse 12. So let's go to Exodus 24. And verse 12. And the Lord said unto Moses, Come up to me unto the mount, and be there, and I will give thee tables of stone, and a law and commandments which I have written. Thou shalt, that thou mayest teach them. A distinction. They were up in the mountain. This is a special deal. Where he got the tables, and of course he had to do it the second time because he broke the first tables. That's a good story to read of why he broke them with his frustration, and then had to go back and get another set. But God was calling him to come up into the mountain, and I'll be there. And then he would give him the tables of stone. A special law, special transportation. It was in stone. It wasn't a roll that could be damaged or altered. It was in stone, and he took them down to the people. And then it says too that God had written, which I have written, and thou shalt mayest, that thou mayest teach them. It was not just to look at, but actually to teach them. So when the words were written out, kind of a lengthy writing maybe about each one, they'd say that the original tablets only have number 1 and a word, number 2 and a word, number 3 and a word or two, that they could shrink this down. Well, we've got it nicely written out by Moses, right? He said, this is what it said in there. This is what it meant. This is what God said. So in Exodus 20, we have an embellished writing, you might say, of whatever was on the stone. Did God write really small, or did he have very large stones? I don't know. Okay. I guess we don't have to worry about that one either. Okay. There's also the same thing is said in chapter 31, verse 18. So I won't worry you with that one. But next question for us to consider here is, what commandments did the children of Israel have when they left Egypt? Now we're going before Moses' time. Okay, what did they have? Or just at the moment that they left, before they got to the mountain. Okay, we want to see the distinction between sacrificial laws and the law of God. So turn with me to Jeremiah. Jeremiah chapter 7. Jeremiah is going to go back and tell us what they had. Jeremiah 7, 21, 22, and 23. 7, 21. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, put your burnt offerings into your sacrifices, unto your sacrifices, and eat flesh. I spake not unto your fathers, nor commanded them in that day, that I brought them out of the land of Egypt, concerning burnt offerings or sacrifices. Oh, did you get that? He did not speak to them about it. But this thing commanded I them, saying, Obey my voice, and I will be your God, and ye shall be my people, and walk ye in all the ways that I have commanded you, that it may be well with you. He's saying, if you would just hear my voice and obey it. Then we read in the New Testament, he added a law. Well, yeah, they didn't keep it. Now, how do you fix the problem? He wished that he didn't have to have these animals dying and sacrifices and so on. Didn't he say somewhere else, I didn't like your offerings, I wished you didn't have to do the offerings? Yeah, same thing. But here he is giving them these laws later, after they were out of Egypt. Then he had to tell them about the burnt offerings and the sacrifices. What they did before, if you go way back, and you have to think on this a little bit, but the head of the household, the oldest grandpa, was the one that would make sacrifices for the family. Okay? You read some of those about how that went. The oldest grandpa of the family was the one that did the sacrifices for the whole family. Then it got more personal in Moses' time. If you sinned, you did the sacrifice, or you had to go outside of the camp. There's all kinds of rules that were added and what kind of sin that the person did. And here the sacrificing of animals that had to come to be. So when they first came out of Egypt, they didn't have these exact laws because Moses hadn't written them down. God was talking to individuals. He sent them people to speak for them or to them, to warn them and help them and so on. But here's Moses going to write it down for the people, and then they would have to do as God commanded. But if they would do that, God would be with them and it would be well with them. Okay, that's a neat verse to hang on to. What does Jeremiah quote of the Lord as saying? What did God say in Nehemiah? So let's go to Nehemiah. Nehemiah. And chapter 7 and verse 21. One more page in here. Where'd it go? 7:21. No, I crossed over. Chapter 9, I'm sorry, chapter 9. Nehemiah, chapter 9. Okay, I got my paper in here, that's a good idea. Chapter 9, 13 and 14. Thou camest down also upon Mount Sinai, and spakest with them from heaven, and gavest them right judgments and true laws, good statutes and commandments. Well, right judgments, good, true laws, and good statutes and commandments. Good. And makest known unto them thy holy Sabbath, and commandest them precepts, precepts, and statutes, and laws, by the hand of Moses, your servant. So God came down on the mountain, and he did thus and thus. And then he gave to Moses thus and thus. Right? All there in 2 verses. So there is 2 situations going on. But the holy Sabbath day is on here, and thy precepts. Okay, the Sabbath says to keep it holy. Remember to keep it holy. And then it names your servants and your people that are on your property that are maybe not even citizens and so on. It goes down through a list, right? But here is going to be some laws also that are statutes or judgments or precepts. How do you keep the Sabbath? How do you do this and how do you do that? How do you keep this law in every place in the entire world? Because the New Testament, it's going to go to the whole world, right? It's not just in that little piece of latitude and longitude where Moses was. This is going to the entire world. So there's concepts in here, you might say, or precepts that we need to think through and understand how to use it in every part of the world. I was talking with Don Gutman, and he said when he went from here to here, he changed a whole day in an airplane flight of a few miles. Oh yeah, he crossed the international date line. Okay. Yes, and he's an air traffic controller, past, and so that was exciting for him to think of those things. Okay, turn with me to, maybe I could jump this one, but Deuteronomy 4, verse 12 and 13, it says too that there was 2 tables of stone, that they had heard God's voice. Okay, that's Deuteronomy 4, verse 12 and 13. And where did Moses record the ceremonial laws? Of course, that's in, I guess we can look at, don't want to labor this too long, but it's in a book. He recorded it in a book, right? We read about that he wrote it in a book and he recorded it. But that's 2 Chronicles 35, verse 12 is where that would be found, if you're taking notes on that. Where were the 10 Commandments kept? In the ark. Right in the ark, right? In the most holy. The 10 Commandments were kept in there. And in the most holy in the temple. That's in Exodus 40, verse 20, and also 1 Kings 8 and 9. How long will the law of Moses last? Oh, the law of God last. And then we'll get to laws of Moses. But Psalm, this is interesting when you pick up on a Psalm. 111. Psalm 111. And verse 7 and 8. The works of his hands are verity and judgment, and all his commandments are sure. His commandments, God's commandments. They stand fast forever and ever, and are done with truth and uprightness. So his law that he wrote with his own finger, they are going to last forever. And of course, we can look up some of those in the New Testament. But how about Colossians 2, verse 14? Colossians 2 and verse 14. I would have done better if I had blown up this whole page so that I could see it easier. Colossians 2, verse 14. Blotting out the handwriting of ordinances that was against us, which were contrary to us, and took it out of the way, nailing it to his cross. That's verse 14. Something had to come to an end. Because this is talking about blotting it out. Some ordinance. You got to think through those things. The sacrificing system, the temple services, the altars of sprinkling blood and killing animals, all of those things that pertain to those definitely were against us. That's a sad situation that if you did certain inappropriate things, you had to take an animal and it was counted as sin, you had to take a sin offering and so on. They were contrary to us. We had to take away our wealth, our good. We had to hurt ourselves and punish ourselves by taking the animal and killing the animal and holding on to the animal's head while the knife was being put to the animal. That's not a pleasant thing. These were against us. And he took it out of the way, nailing it to his cross. Well, think about other things that are laws, and why would they be nailed to the cross? Doesn't make sense. If there are principles and standards and so on. But the blood, the shedding of blood, Jesus was the Lamb. That is ended. The feast days that pertain to the sacrificing, they had to kill this animal to do certain feast days and so on. That ends because you no longer can do the killing of an animal and sacrifice. Otherwise, you're denying Christ. So the feast days came to an end. The temple itself went away because you're going to worship in all places, not only in this mountain and that mountain, Jesus said, but it's going to be everywhere that you can worship the Lord. That laws of the temple, the fact that you had to build a holy room, there was only one place in the whole world where that could be, and you had to be there 3 times a year, every year. Those laws are not pleasant, they're not easy to keep, and they've gone away because the sacrificial system has come to an end. So these are, when you read these, you have to do a little extra thinking of this, what was the ordinances that were against us. This connects also with another thought here. In this same chapter, but verse 16. So we could read all the way down here, but I'll just start at 16. Let no man therefore judge you in meat or in drinks, or in respect of a holy day, or of a new moon, or of the Sabbath days. And you say, now let's see, we got to think about this. There were meat offerings and drink offerings that were offerings. You had to do them a certain way, you had to have a certain amount of oil that had to go with this offering, and a certain bread that went with this offering. That's gone. And how about these days? They had to have a new moon celebration, sacrifice, and so on. There had to be a new moon celebration. There was extra days during the year that had to be celebrated. And it says Sabbath days. Well, the beginning of the month was actually called the Sabbath day, but there was other Sabbath days, and the 50th year, and the 50th day, and a number of things. They also are in this, that we don't do them. And we're not being judged because we don't do them when the Hebrew people thought you ought to. But we're not being judged on this. Why? Because verse 17, which are a shadow of things to come, but the body is of Christ. These shadows, when you go back to these Old Testament holidays, feast days, new moons, drink offerings and meat offerings, they were shadows of Christ. Shadows of coming into the New Testament. So they don't need to be done anymore. That's what that's saying. If there's something that you're looking at in the Old Testament and you say that has no shadow towards Jesus. For instance, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. What shadow is that for? None. Doesn't point to Christ. It doesn't. You're just doing God's law from day one to the very end. But there are offerings for sacrifices that pertain to Christ, or pointed to Christ, pointed to salvation through Jesus Christ. Okay, there is a time of Reformation mentioned in Hebrews chapter 9, verse 12. The Reformation, let's look at Hebrews, that'll be easier for me. Hebrews chapter 9. And 11 and 12. But Christ, being come and high priest of good things to come, by a greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, that is to say, not of this building, neither by the blood of goats and calves, but by his own blood he entered once into the holy place, having obtained eternal redemption for us. So Jesus is doing this for us, and these things pertain to Christ, so we could say they were shadows. And it wasn't of the goats and the blood of goats and calves, but it was the blood of Jesus Christ in the holy place. So, that's also that we don't have to worry about that. We don't have to go to a certain building, a certain homage or traveling place that you had to go to. But then it also says the Reformation in verse 10. Yeah, that's the one I was looking for. I had to hunt this myself a little bit here. In verse 10, which stood only in meats and drinks and divers washings and carnal ordinances. There you go, those are the things that we're wanting to see the back of, see the end of, imposed on them until the time of Reformation. Reformation is Jesus coming, the first time. The fact that he died on the cross, that he shed his blood for the sins of all mankind, if they will accept his offering, his gift to us. That was the time Christ was the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. The fact that he went to the Heavenly Father and sat down at the right hand of God and became the mediator for us. That's the Reformation, the change of things, the change of service that Jesus was making for us. Now, if I can skip back just a little bit, I'll try to look at a few of these other verses. Isaiah 42 and verse 21 says that he magnified the law. What would Jesus do in the book of Isaiah? In the book of Isaiah, it says Jesus would magnify God's law. And he did. In Ephesians, and this might be one we'd have to look up. Ephesians 2 and verse 15. Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 15. Some of these verses can seemingly be taken up by the wrong people not understanding exactly enough of the laws and get themselves in trouble. Verse 15, having abolished in his flesh the enmity, even the law of commandments contained in ordinances, for to make himself of twain one new man, so making peace. There's a lot of things to talk about in here if we took that time. But he abolished what? The laws of commandments contained in ordinances. Is the Ten Commandments ordinances? No. They're not. They're a law that God wrote with his own finger. So you can separate these two laws. And then you know how it should happen here, that Jesus abolished those things that were problems for us and made it a much easier way to serve the Heavenly Father. God's law in Psalm 19 and verse 17, as well as Romans 7:12, it's called the law of the Lord is perfect. The Ten Commandments. Because we already found them. There's things in Moses' writings, God's laws, that Moses wrote, that were against us, were not good for us, wasn't kindly to us, and it needed to be changed. But God's law again, in Romans 7 verse 12, the law is holy and just and good. We have to put these together and say, is it a different law? Or is it the same law that we're talking about? And it's right, it is a different law. The Ten Commandment law is a perfect law, good and just and holy and perfect. In Hebrews 7 verse 19, it says the law of Moses is what it's pertaining to. It says it makes nothing perfect. Well, it can't be the Ten Commandment law because James says it does make it perfect. Perfect law of liberty. So you have to decide that there are two laws, and you need to separate these into two pieces. And even there, in the ceremonial laws, there's things that we might want to check on. Might be healthy, might be good to do, might be other things to look at. But God's law that he wrote with his finger is perfect, and nothing to be diminished from it. In 1 Corinthians 7 and verse 19, they were talking about circumcision. They were talking about circumcision. And there had to be a distinction that circumcision was for this cause, for this time. The New Testament, it does not have to be. And so there's an explanation going on there that Paul was writing about, that it was not those things that we needed to keep, but we needed to keep the commandments of God. In 1 Corinthians 7, verse 19. Might want to look that one up. What law was in question in the discussions and decisions that had to be made in Acts 15? It was circumcision. They were talking about whether they should get everybody to keep the circumcision or not. And they said there's no commands for this to be done in the New Testament time. So we have to decide that they were talking about the verse 1, 5, and 24. if you're writing that down. That's in Acts 15, verse 1 and then verse 5 and verse 24. It's talking about circumcision, and there's no commands on that in the New Testament that it has to be done. If somebody wants to do it for health reasons or cleanliness or because the doctor's favor it or you name it, that's fine. But it's just not a law that we have to do it to be right with God. Last thing I wanted to point out was that if we were to understand more fully the significance of the sacrificial law versus God's eternal law written with his fingers, what you need to do is read in Hebrews chapter 7, 8, 9, 10. Hebrews, the book of Hebrews. Because that book is trying to explain to the Hebrew people what the changes are. Jesus is better than Moses. He's higher than Moses. Jesus is better than the high priest. And he is the high priest, sitting next to God. He goes down a list of these things, and then you begin to understand more clearly the sacrificial system against the eternal law of God. I had to make that a little bit short here on the end, but I hope it's all fine and clear. God bless.